the Twinblade weapon category across the games tend to be pretty mediocre for the most part. However, they are still very viable and they're really cool, which I guess that's all that matters. Now for today, we're going to rank every single one across the Soulsborne games from worst to best. Now yes, Dark Souls 2 and Elden Ring are the only games that actually have a Twinblade category, so it's not going to be that long of a video. However, we are going to include the Rakuyo from Bloodborne because it kind of looks like a Twinblade, so might as well. But no, we are not going to include the Twinblades from Dark Souls 3. For some reason, that's just what they call the dual-wielding weapons, but all of those things actually fall into different categories, so I can talk about them when I talk about those specific categories. But yeah, let's just get into it. Starting off right at the bottom, we have the Gargoyles Blades. Now, before I talk about how this weapon sucks ass, I first want to talk about Twinblades in general. Now, honestly, I'm not that big of a fan. They do like 3 things well, and the rest is kind of mediocre. Now, starting off with the things that they actually do well, obviously the power sensing jumping attacks, one of the best attacks in the entire game. And to be fair, you can just spam this the entire time and you don't really need any other attack. There's so many things they can actually boost the Twinblade jumping attacks to make them do just colossal damage that it can definitely just cheese the entire game. Another thing that they do well is going to be their Ash of War options. They probably get the most Ash of War options in the entire game because they get everything for smaller weapons. So things like double slash and spinning slash, and they get the faster versions of those skills. They also get stuff for poking attacks like impaling thrust, and they even get polearm options like phantom slash and ice spear. Now, unfortunately, all of these Ash of War options are still better paired alongside other types of weapons, but the fact that Twinblades get good variety is obviously really good. And the last thing that they do well is going to be their running heavy attacks. Specifically, the two-handed running heavy attack, it comes out incredibly quick, and being that it's a heavy attack, it's just going to do some really nice damage too. Now, kind of everything else about the Twinblades, I don't really like. One-handed light attack combos tend to just be outclassed by things like straight swords and curved swords. Even the two-handed light attack combo, the initial first light attack does have like a longer animation because it swings twice. And the first swing doesn't even do good damage. It's like 10% damage. And most of the other damage comes from the second swing, which it doesn't really lunge that far. And the first swing doesn't even stagger a lot of enemies to the point where the second swing actually can just be a guaranteed combo. This attack also does less stance damage than a straight sword. Don't know why the stance damage is literally lower than a straight sword. And the entire light attack combo itself is just going to be still less DPS than most other smaller types of weapons. And their heavy attacks, I'm just not a fan of. The charged heavy attacks do hit multiple times pretty quickly, so it can work alongside the multi-hits talismans. But it's such a long animation, the damage isn't even that good, and it still does just as much stance damage as a fully charged heavy attack of a straight sword, and that has a much faster animation. But as I mentioned, you can just literally just spam jumping heavy attacks with a power stance combo, and you don't really need anything else anyway. But specifically for the Gargoyles Blades, this one sucks in particular because one, it does get the worst range by a lot. It does actually get split holy damage, which is obviously the worst damage type in the game. Gets a descaling in faith with a very high faith requirement at 22. It's also a weapon that cannot be infused, and it gets stuck with a non-unique skill in spinning slash, which spinning slash is cool, but it's not unique and you can't infuse this weapon. But the worst thing of all is that this is a destined death type of weapon. Every single time that you hit with it, it does a destined death animation. You actually see the effect come out with every single swing, but it just doesn't want to give it a destined death effect on the weapon skill. Don't know why it just didn't have a reskinned version of spinning slash that did some percentile damage over time. But yeah, the end result is just a very bad weapon. Number 12, we have the Sorcerer's Twinblade from Dark Souls 2. Now, to talk about Dark Souls 2 Twinblades in general, these are actually going to be pretty decent. I thought these were going to suffer from the same problem that Elden Ring Twinblades did, and that they're going to have longer animations, they don't really stagger as well, the poise damage isn't that high, and their overall DPS tends to just be outclassed by other types of small, quick weapons. But that's not true for the Dark Souls 2 Twinblades, because they actually stagger really well. And with a light attack combo when two-handed, the first swing comes out just as fast as like a dagger attack, and it does some really nice poise damage. And when paired alongside the stone ring, you can just stun lock so many enemies really quickly, do some nice amounts of damage, all while not consuming much stamina as well. Now, specifically with the Sorcerer's Twinblades, this is going to be a weapon catalyst, meaning that the heavy attack actually can cast spells, which in this instance is just going to be sorceries, does not include hexes. And you can just use a light attack to just have it serve as a regular Twinblade. Now, if you still wanted to use a heavy attack, clicking the L2 does actually do that function. Now, in most cases, weapon catalysts are always really fun, very convenient, but they're never going to be optimal at all. If you want to get good spell damage, you're always better off going with a staff. If you want good weapon damage, you're always better off going with another weapon. But it's just the convenience and the fun factor that make these weapons really cool. But the Sorcerer's Twinblades probably does it worse than almost anything else because the damage is just not good, and that is for the spells and for the weapon itself. The weapon just gets really bad scalings at +10. It gets an E in both strength and dexterity. You can infuse it, which is good, and obviously being that it actually does cast sorceries, you actually want to go into a magic infusion, but even at +10 with a magic infusion, it only gives it a C scaling in intelligence, so the damage is not going to be that high. Even if you end up buffing the weapon with things like Crystal Magic Weapon, it feels like it doesn't even really boost the damage. Something like the Blue Flame Straight Sword just does the exact same thing, but just way better does way more damage, and is much more convenient, with much lower requirements, and it weighs a lot less. But yeah, I don't know why this thing gets split magic and dark damage, but it can't cast hexes. That would actually been pretty unique. But yeah, even at really high levels, the weapon is going to be doing really bad damage. And this weapon also does get the worst poise damage at 15 compared to all the other Twinblades getting at least 25. Also gets the worst durability as well. It doesn't really get any unique movesets outside of the power sensing heavy attack. Actually does get a pretty cool spin to win. But I still would never really power sense Twinblades because power sensing Twinblades have the worst moveset I've ever seen in my entire life. Like this is like the halberd power sensing moveset, but you get the range and damage of a Twinblade, which is just terrible. Number 11, we have the Dragon Rider Twinblade from Dark Souls 2. This is going to be another magic-based Twinblade in this game. And it sucks because it just has like nothing going for it. In fact, it actually has more downsides than actual unique features. To start off with, it's a boss weapon, meaning that it's going to require petrified dragon bones, which are hard to come by. And it just doesn't get a unique moveset at all. Don't know why this boss weapon doesn't get anything special, but like the moveset is just identical even down to the terrible power sensing combos, gets the same counter damage, same poise damage, actually does get some of the lowest durability, but even its scalings aren't even that good. With a magic infusion, it just still gets a B scaling and intelligence, which I guess is okay, but it doesn't scale well with almost any other stat. It also just gets some of the worst requirements in this class at 20 strength and 22 dexterity, which as I mentioned, it just scales terribly with those stats. But worst of all yet, this thing weighs 18 units, which is so much higher than all the other Twinblades. And in fact, it actually weighs more than a lot of Ultra Greatswords in this game. This thing actually weighs the exact same as the Black Knight's Ultra Greatsword, which is just stupid, because this thing actually gets bad damage for a Twinblade. Number 10, the Dark Souls 2 Twinblade. Now, this weapon is just going to be just a very generic basic Twinblade. I could say that it can be a pretty decent early game option because you do acquire it in the Lost Bastille, and the weapon is still perfectly serviceable as a Twinblade. Gets average scalings, doesn't weigh that much, gets the same moveset and range as basically all the other Twinblades. But the thing is, I still wouldn't really bother using it early game because it's hardly even an early game weapon with its 14 strength and 26 dexterity requirements. And you can get other Twinblades earlier on in the game, like the Stone Twinblade. This one does require using a bonfire aesthetic, but you can get it earlier on in the game, has less requirements, way more damage, better scalings, for like basically the exact same moveset. Number 9, we have the Elden Ring Twinblade. Now this is going to be a perfectly fine early game option. You get it right at the beginning. Does get some of the worst damage, but the requirements, the weight isn't that high. The range is practically the same as all the other Twinblades, and it just gets pretty decent scalings in almost every infusion. So although it is going to be outclassed by almost every other Twinblade on this list, it actually does have some uses because in this game, all the Twinblades, you can only get one per playthrough, and being that power sensing Twinblades is just going to be the best way to build them. In more cases than not, you're probably going to be using the Twinblade in the offhand, especially if you're going to go with a dexterity build because this is like the only other one alongside the Godskin Peeler that can actually scale with dexterity. Basically anything that doesn't really scale with strength because it actually does get the lowest strength requirements. So yeah, it can just serve as a pretty nice offhand option. Number 8, the Twinned Night Sword. This is going to be very similar to like the regular Twinblade, just gets a little bit more damage, does have a bit higher requirements, does weigh a little bit more. But this one is just going to scale better off strength. It's not going to do as much damage as a Gargoyles Twinblade, nor have as good as a scaling. But as I was mentioning before, you can only get one per playthrough for every single Twinblade. So if you actually did want to have a strength type build and power stance Twinblades, you're going to be using the Twin Night Sword and probably just throw it in your offhand. Number 7, the Curved Twinblade in Dark Souls 2. Now this is just going to be the best dexterity Twinblade to use in this game. Does have pretty low requirements at 16 strength and 20 dexterity. Does also get a B scaling in that dex stat. The damage actually can be pretty decent, and it still gets the exact same poise damage as most of the other Twinblades, so the stun locking potential can still be there. And also this weapon does get passive bleed, which in PvE doesn't really mean much. Only like 2 enemies in this game can actually be bled out. And the bleed doesn't even do much damage anyway. It's definitely going to be more something for PvP. But the fact that it does do bleed is obviously going to be a positive. Now, there are going to be 2 things about this weapon that's going to make me not put it high on the list. Number 1, it's going to be a Covenant item. You're going to have to farm the Blood Covenant a decent amount just to acquire it, or actually go into New Game +2. And no, you cannot use bonfire aesthetics. So it's definitely going to be the most annoying Twinblade to acquire. And also, it does get to the lowest counter damage at 110, which is not going to be that much of a difference compared to the 120 counter damage that all the other Twinblades get, but the fact that it is lower is just going to be a downside. Number 6, the Godskin Peeler, which is the best dexterity-based Twinblade in Elden Ring. Can actually get some of the highest damage in a dexterity-based infusion. Does actually scale well with plenty of different other infusions. Also doesn't get that high of requirements. It does actually come with the Black Flame Tornado weapon skill, which is an amazing weapon skill. It's an S tier option, but it can be acquired later in the playthrough, and you can just put it on a better weapon than a Twinblade. But the fact that you can have access to Black Flame Tornado earlier on in the game is going to be pretty nice. Now this weapon also does get a unique heavy attack and unique running heavy attack in that it ends the combo with a poking attack, which obviously piercing damage is really cool. Now unfortunately, the trade-off for this is that the animation tends to be a little bit longer, which for the charged heavy attack, it's already long enough. The damage isn't really that high, and the stance damage is still just as much as a straight sword. And also in terms of the running heavy attack, this is actually one of the best moves, and it's mostly because that the attack comes out really fast, and the Godskin Peeler just makes it a little bit slower. Although the trade-off is that it's going to do piercing damage now and do it in a nice poking attack, which I guess is pretty fair. Now this obviously makes for a very popular pairing alongside the Eleonoras Poleblade. You can just throw this one into the offhand because it actually still retains a B scaling in dexterity when it is blood infused, and it can get some very nice damage alongside with that. So yeah, overall it's a pretty solid weapon. Number 5, we have the Stone Twinblade, which this is going to be an amazing strength-based Twinblade to have. Honestly, this is the Twinblade to use until you actually get access to the Red Iron Twinblades, then obviously just switch to that one because that weapon is broken. But this one is going to be the second best Twinblade. Does also get a very decent strength scaling. Unfortunately, it does get a 22 dexterity requirement, but it still gets the same good counter damage, good poise damage. It doesn't weigh that much. The base damage is actually some of the highest. It also just looks really cool as well. It's just a really good weapon. But yeah, unfortunately, the Red Iron Twinblade is just broken and it's just going to be way better. But if you don't like the Red Iron Twinblade moveset for whatever reason, you can honestly just stick with this one. Number 4, we have the Eleonoras Poleblade. Now, I do have very mixed opinions on this weapon. Now, as I mentioned, the best way to build around using a Twinblade is just the power stancing jumping attacks. This one is just one of the best attacks in the entire game. It just breaks everything and it just does so much damage. So if you actually wanted to go with this playstyle and you didn't really care to use any other attack, I wouldn't recommend using the Eleonoras Poleblade because using the other weapon's power stance is just going to be better. You can just get way more damage with the good dexterity or strength based scalings that some of these Twinblades get. Even if you actually wanted to go with bleed still, I'd recommend just going with a bleed infused Twinblade and Godskin Peeler, and this is going to get way more blood loss build up and actually probably just do more damage as well. Because yeah, the Eleonoras Poleblade does not get a good arcane scaling. At plus 10, it only gets a D scaling in arcane. So therefore the blood loss buildup is just not going to go that high. Even the damage itself isn't even going to be that high either. Now it does actually have a unique heavy attack. It does actually spin around a whole bunch more, but it still gets the exact same stance damage and it still is going to be a very long animation. And the heavy attack tends to just be outclassed by the weapon skill that it actually gets, which is Bloodblade Dance, which this weapon skill can either be like the best thing to use or just one of the worst skills to use. Against smaller enemies that can get staggered, this weapon is honestly insane. It can just continuously stun lock them and it can do like upwards of 60 stance damage. Now against those larger enemies, it's not going to be as useful because you get stuck in a longer animation. The damage isn't even that good either. And you're just going to trade out every single time and you're going to lose that trade because their damage, I guarantee, is going to be a lot better than yours. Which is why, as I mentioned before, if it has had a better arcane scaling, the damage and blood loss build up would be higher. But yeah, the main reason it gets this high is because it's very useful in the fact that it can cheese all of these smaller enemies. Number 3, we have the Gargoyles Twinblade from Elden Ring, and I consider this one to be the best Twinblade in the entire game, although they're all pretty close because every single one you can only get one per playthrough. And as I mentioned, power stancing Twinblades are just going to be the best way to build around it. And in that instance, the Gargoyles Twinblade is just going to be the best one at doing that, because it just gets the most damage by a lot. It does actually get the worst amount of range, but that extra damage is just way too good to pass up. And the weapon also does get very good scalings with almost every infusion, so if you still wanted to go with a bleed-based build, Bleed Gargoyles obviously going to be really good. Now, honestly, when I'm building around power sensing Gargoyles, I don't really care to go with bleed, because you can just get way more raw damage with just like a strength-based build, and you can just fuck up enemies that way as well. Now, obviously, if you go up against those enemies that are weaker to bleed, it's probably just going to be better with a bleed infusion. But I think on average, just a regular strength build is just going to perform better. Number 2, we have the Rakuyo from Bloodborne. Now, when left in its normal state, it does have like the twin blade look to it because like there's a blade on either side of the handle, which I guess falls under the requirements. Now, in this twin blade state, the weapon is kind of mid. The moveset is not that good. It's pretty slow. The range isn't even that crazy. The DPS is not really that high. You only really have it in this state when you want to just parry, because almost all the time you just want to have it transformed and do the power stancing combo, which when it's in this state, I guess it's no longer a twin blade. So it's going to be like kind of defeating the purpose of including it onto this list. But if I didn't include it onto this list, then everyone's going to be like, oh, where's the Rakuyo? Why didn't you include the Rakuyo onto the list? So yeah, might as well talk about it. But yeah, the weapon gets a really good skill scaling. You can actually buff it, so it can actually result in this amazing damage. But the best part about the weapon is going to be its transform state when using all the amazing combos that it does get. With like the regular light attack combo, even the L2 combos are just incredible. Those things can just output a lot of damage and stun lock smaller enemies really quickly. And being that you are hitting multiple times very quickly, you can actually build up your beast hood at a very quick rate. So when using those beast blood pellets, it can just result in even higher damage. And when comboing in those light attacks into the L2 attacks, it can just make for one of the most fun and most powerful weapons in the entire game. And at number 1, we have the red Iron Twinblades, which is probably the best strength weapon in the entirety of Dark Souls 2. This thing is just stupid damage. Now to start off with the downsides, this thing does get a 20 dexterity requirement, doesn't actually get any scalings in dexterity, so it's basically just wasted stats. Does actually weigh 14 units, which can be on the heavier side. The first initial light attack does only swing once compared to the other Twinblades actually swinging multiple times. And being that those weapons actually swing faster, you actually can stun lock a bit quicker. So in some cases, it might be a bit harder to use. But a combo I like to use is either leading off with a running attack or backstepping attack, because the follow-up light attack afterwards comes out really fast. And once you end up doing your second and third light attack combo when two-handed, it just does immense damage because it just hits multiple times very quickly, and it can just decimate all enemies in the entire game because for some reason this thing just gets ridiculously high damage. The base damage is like so much higher than all the other Twinblades. It gets amazing scalings, A scaling and strength, and it gets B scalings across the board with almost every other elemental infusion. Still retains the same good 120 counter damage, but it also just gets the highest amount of poise damage out of all the other Twinblades at 30. And when paired alongside the Stone Ring, this thing could actually do just as much poise damage as great swords in this game actually can do more poise damage, which for a weapon that swings this quickly and does this much damage, it's just going to be insane. Unfortunately, it is acquired later in the playthrough in the Shrine of Amana, but once you do pick it up, the rest of the game and the DLC is just going to be a complete cakewalk. Anyway, that is the video now completed. As always, let me know what your opinions are down in the comments. And also just let me know what type of ranking you'd like to see next. I don't really know what I want to do. So if you have any recommendations, just let me know down in the comments. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.